So I'm here to talk about governance in Web 3.0. And I'm going to do that with basically a story, a couple of examples, and a metaphor. So the story is I was present at the creation. That was back in 1998 when the US government got together with the EU to create what was supposed to be the worldwide internet community coming together to manage the domain name system and the address system. And it was kind of a, how shall we say, a messy conception because, of course, the worldwide internet community was fractured. The business people said, keep your hands off our internet. The technical people said, we don't need no government interference. The foreigners said, we don't want the US and the EU being in charge. And in the middle of all this, this thing was supposed to appear by, common acclaim. The guy actually running the technical underpinnings was called Jon Postel. And in September, he had heart surgery and then died, not mysteriously, of complications. So the whole thing was kind of pulled together by a bunch of lawyers. They wanted a board that did not represent the fractured internet. So most of them didn't actually know much about the internet. I knew something, wasn't technical. There was Vint Cerf and Jun Marai from Asia, but the rest of them barely used email. And we made a number of mistakes. First of all, our board meetings, because of the lawyers, were initially closed. One of the board members said in public, it's a stupid argument because if they open the board meetings, we'll just make all the decisions at dinner the night before, so what's the difference? And more trolling, etc. So it was a challenging 2 years. We did manage to deal with the monopoly of network solutions over the two registries for .com and .net. .org ultimately was given to ISOC, another nonprofit, to manage for the good of the internet. So things calmed down. But I consider ICANN not a failure, but it certainly didn't meet its promise. It kept governments from ruling the internet, which was what everybody, except for a few governments, really wanted. But what it did do was it turned the whole thing into a protection racket, basically a source of money for very little value. When we created more domain names like .info, .help, .drink, everybody who had a cool brand name had to go out and buy a lot more domain names to protect that brand name. And the reason this happened was because the ultimate governance of ICANN was the registries, registrars, trademark lawyers, holders of lots of domain names, and the users and the internet community at large, who were supposed to be the people running it, were, they were too busy. They paid a few $100s a year for their internet, so they didn't get involved. But in the end, I'd rather have my money taken than my voice silenced. So it worked more or less. Then a year and a half ago, .org, the outfit holding it, the Internet Society, decided it wanted to sell it so that instead of having a steady income stream, they could have an endowment. They wanted to sell it to a private equity firm. And a bunch of us kind of came back together and said, folks, this is not right. This is a nonprofit. It can't be bought or sold. It's a duty to hold it, and you get paid for doing that, but you can't sell the thing. And fortunately, this was just as COVID was arriving. We managed to keep .org as a nonprofit with a mission rather than sort of take away its soul and turn it into an object to be sold. This informs how I think about internet governance for Web 3.0 in many, many ways. We face a really interesting time, the notion of decentralized organizations, blockchain, and so forth and so on. They're all really exciting, but we need to understand the big challenges are not about the technology. The challenges are about the governance models. When you take a DAO, for example, in theory it's controlled by the owners of the tokens that represent ownership, but many of those are also in a DAO, they're also the people who work there, and there's sort of a conflict some of them get more or less interested, but their ownership stakes don't change. You have VCs who clearly, they get this, but somehow they think at some point they're going to be able to sell this DAO and make an exit, because that's what VCs are about. And who are the users? Who are the customers and the beneficiaries? Is it a nonprofit or not? These are the kinds of questions we need to deal with. When I look at governance models, none of them quite works, partly because you have the DNA, which is a mission or a founding goal or some kind of identity, call it a nervous system, an immune system that says who you are. But at some point that gets taken over by the metabolism, which, for human beings, it's sugar and food. For companies and investors, it's money. And they start tailoring their mission to where the money comes from. And then you get really pernicious business models like addicting people to your food or your games. And that's not going to work. So I think I'm here more to ask questions than to give solutions, but I want to suggest one solution that would be interesting at least to look at, which is so-called deliberative democracy. It's basically like a jury. When you think about how people vote, it's emotion, it's, I like that guy, he's telling it to the people, yes. When they're on a jury, first of all, it's a small group. They've been selected at least semi-randomly, and that's a question to be figured out. And they really care about the problem. They take the time to understand what the issues are. They may have somebody standing in front of them who's either going to be charged with something or not. There may be victims. And so there's a real engagement, a real attempt to understand the truth and to make a good decision in a jury of your peers. And to the extent you can get that kind of attention and that kind of long-term thinking around the big decisions that any organization has to make, I think there's some hope. So thank you.